Alberta, 1894. He said it on a gray Thursday morning in October, standing in the doorway of the feed store with sawdust on his boots and his hat in his hands, watching her load flour sacks into the wagon with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never expected anyone to help. He hadn't planned it. He had come in for grain and a length of rope. The words came out the way honest things sometimes do, before a person has the sense to stop them. "You know, Millie, the man who ends up with you is going to be the luckiest man in the whole of the Northwest Territories." He expected a laugh, a polite deflection, the kind of easy response that lets everyone get on with their day, without anyone having to be particularly brave. Instead, she set down the flour sack. Slowly. The way you set something down when your hands have suddenly stopped working the way they're supposed to. She didn't look at him right away. When she did, her expression was something he had never seen on her before, steady and frightened and decided, all at the same time. And she said very quietly, "I've been hoping you'd figure that out." The wind came off the foothills and moved through the gap between the buildings. A horse shifted on its tether. The world kept going, entirely indifferent. And Theodore Crane stood in the doorway of Selkirk's Feed and Supply in the town of Harrow Creek, Alberta, and understood that something had just changed between them that could not be changed back. He wasn't sure he wanted it changed back. Theodore Crane was 31 years old and ran a modest grain farm on the eastern edge of the foothills, 12 miles from Harrow Creek. He was not a complicated man. He worked from before the light and stopped when he couldn't see his hands in front of him, and on Sundays he rested and read whatever came through the lending library, which wasn't much, but was enough. What he didn't have, what he had stopped noticing he didn't have, was someone to sit across from at supper. He had his neighbor Pete Drum for company when the seasons required it, and his own thoughts the rest of the time, and he had told himself this was sufficient, and had mostly believed it. His nearest neighbors to the south were the Lacombe family, Bertrand, his wife Suzette, and their daughter Millicent, who everyone called Millie except her mother, who called her Millicent when she was proud of her, and Mill when she was not. Millie Lacombe was 27. She had come back from 2 years in Edmonton the previous spring, where she had been keeping house for her mother's cousin and putting away what money she could. She returned without ceremony and resumed the rhythms of the Lacombe farm as though she had only stepped out briefly. She helped her father with the accounts because Bertrand's eyesight was going, though no one in the family mentioned it directly. She put up preserves in August. She rode out to check the fence lines because the work needed doing and she was capable of doing it. Theodore had known her for years. He had spoken to her at the grain exchange, at the church social, at the Lacombe table twice when weather had caught him out on the road, and Bertrand had waved him in the way people did in that country without needing a reason. He had thought of her the way you think of someone solid and real and good. Present in the landscape of your daily life without your quite registering how central they've become. He had not until a Thursday in October understood what he was actually looking at. It had started 2 months before. Without his knowing, it had started at all. The Lacombes ran a small cattle operation alongside their grain, and in August one of Bertrand's fence lines had come down in a storm, sending 6 head onto Theodore's east field. Millie had come over at first light to help round them up. She arrived before he had finished his coffee, which said something about either her diligence or her sense of urgency, possibly both. They spent 3 hours on horseback in the cool morning, working the cattle back through the gap. She was a good rider. Not showy about it, just competent in the way of someone who had been doing it since childhood, adjusting her seat and reading the animals without making a performance of either. Afterward, he made coffee, and they sat on the step of his porch because the kitchen wasn't fit for company. She drank it without complaint, though he suspected it was not very good. "Your east fence needs restringing too," she said. "I know. Papa could lend you the wire stretcher. I'd be grateful." They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who don't feel the need to fill it, watching the morning warm-up over the fields. A gopher ran along the fence line. A hawk circled above the north pasture. She left after finishing the coffee, and Theodore went back to his work, and it was only that evening, lying in the dark, that he realized he had been thinking about the morning on and off all day, without quite knowing why. He didn't examine it. He was a man who trusted work more than introspection, and there was always more work. In September, her father's back went out during harvest. Theodore heard about it from Pete Drum on a Monday and drove over to the Lacombe farm that afternoon, with no particular plan beyond seeing if there was something useful he could do. Bertrand was in bed and loudly unhappy about it. Suzette was managing the kitchen end. Millie was in the field. He found her at the grain binder, fighting a jam in the knotter mechanism with a combination of patience and language he wouldn't have expected from her. "Can I help?" he said. She looked up. There was chaff in her hair. "Do you know the Massey binder?" "Tolerably well." "Then yes," she said, and handed him a wrench. They worked on it for an hour and got it going again. Then he drove the binder through the afternoon while she stooked behind, and they came in at dusk when the light gave out. Suzette had supper waiting, and she wouldn't hear of him leaving, so he stayed. Bertrand ate at the table, back and dignity both requiring it. He told a long story about a harvest in 1878 that had been worse than this one by every measurable standard, which was probably meant to be comforting, and was, in its way. On the drive home, Theodore watched the stars come out over the foothills and thought, without particularly meaning to, that he had not felt that comfortable at a table in a very long time. He went back 3 more times that week, because the harvest wouldn't wait and there wasn't enough help. On the 4th day, when they were finally done, Millie sat down on a stook and looked at the finished field and said, without any particular drama, "I don't know what we'd have done." "Same thing," he said, "just slower." She looked at him sideways. "You're very modest for someone who just saved our harvest." "I had good company," he said, which was true, and also, he realized as he said it, slightly more than he had intended to reveal. She smiled, not a polite smile, a real one, the kind that didn't perform for anyone. He drove home thinking about that smile for rather longer than was sensible. It was Bertrand who said the obvious thing first, because Bertrand was a man who had survived 40 years of farming by cutting straight to what needed doing. This was in early October, when Theodore had come by to return the wire stretcher and ended up staying to help repair the gate on the south pasture. Millie was somewhere in the barn. Bertrand stood watching him work with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man choosing his words. "You're here a lot," Bertrand said. "There's been work to do." "There's always work to do somewhere," Bertrand said. "You seem to find it mostly here." Theodore kept his eyes on the gate hinge. "You've been short-handed, Theodore." He looked up. "I've been watching you watch my daughter for 2 months," Bertrand said. Not unkindly. Matter of fact, the way he talked about everything. "You're a decent man and I like you, but I'd appreciate knowing whether you're going to do something about it or whether we're just going to carry on pretending." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on it," he said. Bertrand made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "Don't work too slowly," he said. "She's patient, but she's not made of stone." He walked back to the house. Theodore finished the gate and stood in the thin October sun, thinking about what it meant that Bertrand had said it at all, which was, he suspected, that it had been visible to everyone except him. He went into town the following Thursday for grain and rope, which was when it happened. He had thought about it on the drive-in, about what Bertrand had said, about September and the harvest and the mornings at the step with bad coffee. He had not arrived at any conclusions. He was not, as a rule, a man who arrived at conclusions easily. He preferred to let things settle. But then he walked into Selkirk's and saw her loading flour sacks, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her hair catching the gray October light through the door, and his better judgment went somewhere it wasn't needed, and the words came out. "You know, Millie, the man who ends up with you is going to be the luckiest man in the whole of the Northwest Territories." He had meant it as an honest observation. He had not meant it as an opening. But she set down the flour sack, and she didn't deflect, and she said, very quietly, "I've been hoping you'd figure that out." The silence afterward was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has something in it, full rather than empty. Theodore turned his hat over in his hands. He was 31 years old and had faced blizzards and failed harvests and a barn fire, and had not felt as entirely unmoored as he did, standing in the doorway of a feed store in October. "Millie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I meant what I said." "I know you did," she said. "That's why I answered the way I did. You don't say things you don't mean." "I should have said something before now." She looked at him steadily. "You're here now." He looked at her for a moment, then put his hat back on. "I'd like to come call on you properly, with your father's permission." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like relief, the way a door opens that's been stuck for a while. "He'll say yes," she said. "He'll also probably tell you it took you long enough. He told me something similar last week." "He told me the same thing last spring," she said, dry as the October air. He laughed. He hadn't expected to. She picked up her flour sack and settled it in the wagon, with the efficiency of someone who has practical matters to it too, regardless of what else is happening. "Papa gets in from the south field by 4, she said, not looking at him. "He takes his tea on the porch." "I'll be there at 1:30, Theodore said. She nodded once, businesslike, but as he turned to go in for his grain, he caught the edge of a smile she hadn't quite managed to put away, and he carried it with him the rest of the day like something he intended to keep. He arrived at 4:20 because he had changed his shirt twice and was trying to compensate for lost time. Bertrand was already on the porch. He had a cup of tea and the expression of a man who had been informed of what was coming and had arranged himself accordingly. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. They sat looking at the foothills going purple in the late afternoon light. A raven crossed the sky from east to west. "I'd like to come calling on Millie," Theodore said. "With your permission." Bertrand was quiet for a moment. "What took you so long?" he said. Not unkindly, genuinely curious. "I was slow," Theodore said. "You were afraid," Bertrand said, which was a more precise version of the same thing. He looked at the hills. "Millie doesn't ask for things she doesn't require. But she deserves a man who sees her, not the idea of her. I see her," Theodore said. Bertrand looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. "Suzette sets supper at 6, he said. "You might as well stay." He stayed for supper 4 nights that week. On the 5th evening, he and Millie walked to the edge of the south pasture in the last of the daylight and stood looking at the foothills going dark and talked about the farm, about the winter coming, about what she had thought of Edmonton and why she had come back. "Were you glad to come back?" he said. She considered it. "I think home is less a place than a set of people," she said. "Edmonton had things Harrow Creek doesn't have. But Harrow Creek has things Edmonton doesn't have either." She looked at him briefly, then away. He understood she might be including him in that accounting. He didn't say so. Some things are better left as understood. "Are you happy here?" he said. "On the farm." With this life, she was quiet for a moment. "I think happiness is mostly made," she said, "not stumbled upon. People who wait for the right circumstances usually find out later the circumstances were already right." She looked at him. "What about you?" "I think," he said carefully, "that I'm considerably happier than I was in August." She smiled. "You're getting there," she said. November came in cold and definite the way Alberta Novembers do, without apology. The courtship moved at the pace of 2 people who also had working farms, which meant it happened in the gaps. Sunday afternoons, supper evenings, the occasional ride along the fence lines when the weather allowed. He brought her a book he thought she'd like, from the lending library. She read it and left it on his step 3 days later with a note tucked inside that said only page 47, and he read page 47 and understood exactly what she meant by it and thought about it for a week. She was like that, precise. She didn't waste words or gestures. What she did say and do landed with a weight that things meant for performance rarely have. He fixed the sticking hinge on the Lacombe barn door one afternoon without mentioning it to anyone. Bertrand mentioned it 2 weeks later with a handshake that communicated more than any speech. And then one evening in mid-November, something happened that he never told her about. He was walking across the field toward the Lacombe house for supper. The snow had come, and the fields were white, and the lights of the farmhouse were yellow and warm in the dark. He stopped, not because anything was wrong, because something was exactly right, and that frightened him in a way that nothing wrong ever quite managed to. He stood in the snow in the dark with the farmhouse lights ahead of him and understood fully what he was walking toward. Not just supper, not just Millie, but the wanting of it, the real kind, the kind that can be taken away. He had learned, young, what it cost to want things directly. His father had died when Theodore was 19, and the farm had come to him before he was ready, and he had worked it alone for 12 years, and somewhere in that time he had gotten very good at not expecting things, not wanting them out loud where they could be seen. He stood in the snow for a while. Then he walked forward anyway. Millie opened the door before he knocked. She always heard him coming across the snow. "You're late," she said. "The soup's going to be too thick." He stepped inside into the warmth and the smell of supper, and Suzette at the stove and Bertrand in his chair by the window, and looked at Millie handing him his coat hook, and thought, clearly and without any particular drama, "This is what I almost didn't let myself have." He asked her in late November at the south pasture gate. He had considered more elaborate settings, the ridge above the valley, the view of the Rockies on a clear morning. But when the moment came, none of them felt right. The gate was where they had first stood and talked, really talked, on an evening when he had come to fix it, and she had come to check on him, and they had ended up leaning on either side of it for an hour while the light went. It seemed right to come back. The snow had made everything quiet. Millie had her wool coat, and her breath came in small clouds, and she was looking at him with the expression she wore when she already knew what was coming and was waiting for him to arrive. He told her what he meant plainly, the way he had learned she preferred. "I know I was slow," he said, "and I know it took me longer than it should have to understand what was in front of me. But I understand it now. I see you clearly. Every day I see you clearly, and I want to keep doing that for the rest of my life. I want to build something with you. A home and a life and whatever comes with it." He paused. "I'd very much like it if you'd marry me." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were steady. The wind moved through the fence wire and made its low sound. "Theodore Crane," she said, "it is about time. Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small dark stone garnet that had come west in a trunk from Ontario and had been waiting in a cedar box in his bureau for 2 years since his grandmother had pressed it into his hands on her last visit and told him not to waste it on someone who didn't deserve it. He put it on her finger there at the south pasture gate, with the snow on the fields and the mountains somewhere behind the gray cloud to the west. She looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. Not at the ring itself, but at what it stood for. Then she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time, and the November wind moved through the fence wire the way it always had, and nothing was different except everything. That winter was the best of Theodore's life so far, not because it was easy. Winters in Alberta are not designed for ease. There were cattle to check on, pipes to watch, wood to split and move twice before it was dry enough. But now there was supper at the Lacombes twice a week, and the walk home in the cold with the feeling of someone beside him even when he was alone, and the knowledge, solid as good timber, that spring was coming. He worked on the house that winter. Not elaborately. The bedroom needed a second window. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the stove that had needed attention for 3 years. He fixed the porch steps, which had been an embarrassment since before anyone's memory. He didn't tell Millie. He just did it because the house was hers too, even if she didn't know it yet. When Suzette Lacombe heard the news, she had set down her mixing bowl and put both hands over her mouth and stood like that for a moment before she stepped forward and took Millie's face in her hands and looked at her the way mothers look when something they have been carrying quietly for years finally comes to rest. Then she looked at Theodore and said, "I always knew it would be you." Which was, he suspected, the truth. Bertrand had shaken his hand firmly and said, "Finally," which was also true. Pete Drum, told the next morning, had looked at Theodore for a long, steady moment and said, "Ha, well," which from Pete was nearly a speech. In February, Millie came to see the farmhouse to think about what would need doing before the wedding. She moved through the rooms quietly, noting things: the new bedroom window, the repaired floor, the porch steps that no longer required careful navigation. She stopped at the kitchen steps. "You fixed these," she said. "They needed it. You did all of this without telling me." "I did." She was quiet for a moment. "Why the window in the bedroom? The light comes in from the east in the morning," he said. "I thought you'd want it." She didn't say anything for a moment. She walked across the kitchen to where he was standing and took his hand, both of hers, around one of his, the way you hold something you mean to keep. "Thank you," she said. 3 words. Quiet, no performance. He understood she was not thanking him for the window. She was thanking him for what the window meant, that he had stood in that room in the dark of January before she was there yet and thought about the quality of her mornings. That he had made something ready for her arrival without asking for acknowledgement, without needing her to see him do it. That is what love looks like when it has settled into itself. It doesn't announce, it just turns east and waits for the light. The wedding was on a Saturday in April when the snow had finally gone from the lower fields and the poplars were coming into leaf and the sky was the particular blue that only arrives in the Alberta spring after a winter that has tried everything it had. Half of Harrow Creek came. Millie wore a dress her mother had spent the winter making. Pale gray wool with a cream collar and small pearl buttons down the front. Simple, right, exactly like her. She walked to him on her father's arm with her chin level and her eyes clear, and Theodore stood at the front of the little church and thought, with the full force of a man who has almost missed something. "I cannot believe I was slow about this." Reverend McIntosh kept it brief, which everyone agreed was his best quality. Bertrand's voice caught on the words, "Who gives this woman?" and there was a small ripple through the pews that men in the congregation pretended not to notice. Theodore said his vows looking at Millie. They were for her, not the room. She said hers the same way. Then they were married. Old Mitchell played the fiddle in the churchyard, and the tables came out, and people ate and danced until the sky went orange over the mountains. Someone brought a raisin cake that was better than it had any right to be. Pete Drum danced exactly once, badly, with evident satisfaction. That night in the farmhouse with the east window and the new floor, Millie sat at the kitchen table with her hair down, and both hands around a cup of tea, and looked at Theodore with an expression that was new and also permanent. Something that had settled in her face and intended to stay. "We're going to be all right here," she said, not a question. "Better than all right," he said. "You think so. I know so." She smiled, that particular smile that didn't perform for anyone. "You've gotten less cautious," she said. "I've gotten less afraid," he said, which was the same thing said better. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Good," she said. "I didn't want to marry a man who was going to keep 1 foot out the door." "Both feet in," he said. "As of October," she corrected. "In the feed store." He thought about it. "As of August," he said. "I just didn't know it yet." She looked at him. "As of considerably before August," she said. "But I was patient. You were. Don't make me be patient again." "No," he said, and meant it. "I won't." The years that followed were made from ordinary days and honest work, and the particular richness of 2 people who choose each other and go on choosing through the difficult seasons and the good ones, without drama and without doubt. The farm grew, a second barn in the 3rd year, better drainage on the east field that had always been wet in spring. Millie took over the accounts fully when Bertrand's eyes finally required it, and organized a seed-lending arrangement among the farms of the district that started as a practical solution and became quietly one of those things a community relies on without quite naming. Their first child came in the spring of the second year. A girl they named Josephine for no particular reason except that it suited her, which it did from the first day. She arrived with opinions and held them firmly. Millie said she got that from Theodore. Theodore said she got it from Millie. The evidence supported both arguments. A boy followed 2 years later, James for Theodore's father. He had his grandfather's patience and his mother's precision and would grow up to be the kind of man that communities build on. On a Thursday in October, Theodore had long since decided that Thursdays were significant. He was repairing the south pasture gate again, because gates need repairing, and this one had been doing it for years, when Millie came across the field with both children. Josephine running ahead in the way of children who have only one speed. James toddling with fierce determination behind her. Millie raised a hand. He climbed the gate and went to them. Josephine demanded to be lifted. James, not to be outpaced, demanded the same. A negotiation was conducted. Later, when the children had run themselves out and were leaning against their parents in the long afternoon light, Millie rested her head against his shoulder. "I was thinking," she said, "about that day in Selkirk's. You said whoever married me would be lucky. I meant it. I know you did." She was quiet a moment. "I'm the lucky one, though." He looked at her. "I'm the lucky one." "We're both lucky," she said, in the practical way she had of settling things. "We're both lucky," he agreed. The foothills had gone gold with October. The mountains to the west held the last of the afternoon sun on their high faces. Harrow Creek lay somewhere below them in the valley, going about its business. The fields they had worked together for years spread out around them in the quiet. And Theodore Crane held his family in the October light and understood, with the full weight of a man who knows exactly what things cost, what he had very nearly let himself miss, and was grateful for it down past words. He had been slow. He had been afraid. He had stood in a dark field in November and nearly turned back. But he had walked forward. That is the thing worth saying. Not that he was brave or swift or sure. Only that when it mattered, he walked forward. Most of us have stood in it, the lights of somewhere warm and true just ahead, and all the old reasons to stop right where we are. Walk forward anyway. The soup might be too thick, and someone might tell you it took you long enough, and they would be right on both counts. But you'd be there, and being there is everything.